Welcome back to your nerdy show. I'm your host, Spoiler Master. What if I told you that the Season 3 finale of House of the Dragon changes some of the biggest events from Fire and Blood so dramatically that, in several cases, we're basically watching a completely different version of the Dance of the Dragons. We're talking about Rhaenyra publicly revealing the Song of Ice and Fire prophecy, Helena's completely rewritten death, Daemon showing up at Tumbleton when he isn't even there in the book, and even the infamous 2 betrayers being reduced to just 1. So how different is the show from Fire and Blood? And more importantly, what do all these changes mean for the story going forward? Let's break it all down. Rhaenyra reveals the Song of Ice and Fire. One of the biggest changes comes when Rhaenyra does something that never happens in Fire and Blood. After ordering the execution of the High Septon, she steps outside the Great September and addresses the people of King's Landing. But this isn't just another political speech. Rhaenyra reveals the secret prophecy passed down from Aegon the Conqueror, the Song of Ice and Fire, and connects herself directly to the destiny of Westeros. She essentially presents herself as the chosen ruler who must prepare the realm for the coming threat from the north. And in the book, none of this happens. Rhaenyra never publicly reveals Aegon's prophecy. She never announces herself as the prince that was promised, and there isn't even an equivalent scene where she claims to be the chosen one. The reason the show makes this change is actually pretty interesting, because it's pushing Rhaenyra towards something much darker. She's no longer simply a woman fighting for what she believes is her rightful throne. She's becoming someone who genuinely believes that destiny itself has chosen her. And that's dangerous, because once a ruler starts believing that they're not just entitled to power, but literally destined to have it, where exactly does the line get drawn? Who actually controls Tumbleton? Now let's talk about Tumbleton, because this is where the show makes a massive strategic change. In the series, Ormund Hightower and the Greens have been holding Tumbleton, and Rhaenyra's forces, with Daemon leading the attack, arrive to take the town from them. But in Fire and Blood, the situation is basically the complete opposite. Rhaenyra's forces already control Tumbleton. The River Lords and Northmen are using the town as a defensive stronghold against the advancing Hightower army, which means the Greens are actually the attackers. And that might sound like a small change, but it completely alters the context of the battle. Think of it like 2 teams fighting over a stadium. In the show, Team Green is already inside and Team Black is trying to storm the building. In the book, Team Black is inside, defending it, while Team Green is trying to break in. Same location, completely different battle. And that change becomes even more important when we get to the betrayal that follows. Only Ulf betrays Rhaenyra. If you've read Fire and Blood, you know the infamous 2 betrayers, Ulf the White and Hugh Hammer. These 2 dragon riders originally fight for Rhaenyra, but during the first Battle of Tumbleton, they switch sides and turn their dragons against the Blacks. But the show changes this in a huge way. Here, Ulf is the only major dragon rider who openly turns against Rhaenyra, and his betrayal is much more personal. Ormund Hightower offers Ulf incredible rewards, including Driftmark, but Ulf is also treated with contempt and humiliation. Eventually, all that resentment boils over, and he unleashes Silverwing. And once Ulf starts burning the battlefield, he doesn't seem particularly interested in choosing a side anymore. He burns black soldiers, green soldiers, and even the town itself. It's basically Ulf saying, if I'm going down, everybody's coming with me. But in the book, Hugh Hammer also betrays Rhaenyra. That's why they're remembered as the 2 betrayers. Hugh rides Vermithor, Ulf rides Silverwing, and together they turn their dragons against the Black forces. And that brings us to another character whose story has been dramatically rewritten. Helena's death is completely rewritten. Helena's death is one of the most tragic moments in the story, but the show gives it a very different motivation. In the series, Helaena is imprisoned inside Maegor's Holdfast. She's pregnant, she's being mistreated, she's being force-fed, and she's essentially trapped inside a nightmare. Then Mysaria warns her that Rhaenyra won't simply release her or her unborn child. Helaena eventually finishes her prophetic tapestry, and then jumps from the window. It's horrifying, but the book tells a very different story. Helaena also jumps from a window and dies after being impaled on the spikes below, but the biggest trigger is the death of her youngest son, Maelor. And that's important because Maelor doesn't even exist in the show, so the emotional foundation of Helena's death has been completely changed. In Fire and Blood, her grief is directly connected to the loss of her child. In the show, it's much more about imprisonment, manipulation, pregnancy, and the feeling that there's simply no escape. Helaena dies much earlier in the show, and there's another major difference with Helena's death. because the timing has also been changed. In the show, Helaena dies during Rhaenyra's occupation of King's Landing, before the battle above the God's Eye. But in the book, Helaena survives much longer. Her death happens after the battle above the God's Eye, the legendary confrontation between Daemon and Ormund. And that means the show has essentially moved Helena's death forward in the timeline. This is important because the Dance of the Dragons is basically one giant chain reaction. One event causes another, which causes another, which completely changes what happens next. The show is moving some of those dominoes around, and nowhere is that more obvious than with Daemon. Daemon is at Tumbleton, but he isn't in the book. In the show, Daemon personally leads the assault on Tumbleton with Caraxes. And let's be honest, seeing Daemon and Caraxes unleashed in battle is exactly the kind of spectacle House of the Dragon wants to give us. But according to Fire and Blood, Daemon isn't there. At this point in the book's timeline, Daemon is somewhere else, searching for Ormund and Vhagar with nettles. So the show has effectively pulled Daemon away from his book storyline and inserted him directly into the Tumbleton conflict. From a television perspective, it makes sense. Instead of watching a massive historical battle through distant accounts, the audience gets one of the show's biggest characters right in the middle of the action. But changing Daemon's location creates another major difference, because Corlys is also in a completely different situation. Corlys is a prisoner in the show. In the series, Corlys Velaryon is being held captive by the Greens and is used as leverage. And the show makes this especially brutal by having his severed finger sent to Alan. It's a very personal form of intimidation, and it gives the conflict between the Velaryons and the Greens another emotional layer. But this isn't what happens in Fire and Blood. Corlys isn't sitting inside a Green prison during these events. Instead, he's in King's Landing, advising Rhaenyra. So once again, the show has changed the location and role of a major character in order to create a more dramatic storyline. And the same thing happens with another Hightower, Gwayne. Gwayne Hightower is alive in the show. Gwayne Hightower is another character whose fate has been completely changed. In the show, he's alive and present around the Tumbleton storyline. He attempts to negotiate peace, survives the battle, and later goes searching for Daeron. But in the book, Gwayne is already dead by this point. He was killed during the fall of King's Landing when Rhaenyra took the city. So the show has effectively given Gwayne an entire new chapter that never existed in the source material. And this is important because Gwayne isn't the only character whose storyline around Tumbleton has been altered. Daeron's role has also been handled very differently. Daeron and Targaryen are handled differently. Daeron is one of the most important figures at Tumbleton in Fire and Blood. When he arrives on Targaryen, his presence helps turn the battle in the Greens' favor. And this is one of the reasons the first Battle of Tumbleton becomes such an important moment in the dance. But the show handles Daeron much more cautiously. He's present, but his involvement with Targaryen isn't presented in exactly the same way as it is in the book, and the series deliberately leaves his fate uncertain. In Fire and Blood, Daeron survives the first Battle of Tumbleton. His death comes later, during the second Battle of Tumbleton, and even then, the exact circumstances are surrounded by uncertainty. So if you're wondering whether the show is about to reveal Daeron's death immediately, don't assume anything yet. The series has already shown us that it's willing to completely rearrange his storyline. Rhaenyra and the High Septon. Now let's go back to the Great September, because the confrontation between Rhaenyra and the High Septon is another major change. In the show, Rhaenyra goes to the Great September seeking formal anointment, but the High Septon refuses her. And Rhaenyra doesn't exactly take that rejection gracefully. Alan executes the High Septon, and Rhaenyra then walks outside and addresses the crowd. It's an incredibly important moment because it shows just how far she's willing to go to secure her claim. But in Fire and Blood, there's no equivalent public confrontation where Rhaenyra executes the High Septon in this dramatic fashion. The relationship between Rhaenyra, the Faith, and the people of King's Landing is complicated in the book, but the show has intensified everything into a much more cinematic confrontation. And that brings us back to Ulf, because his betrayal isn't simply about politics. It's also about personality. Ulf's betrayal is much more personal. In Fire and Blood, Ulf and Hugh's betrayal is largely opportunistic. They're ambitious men with dragons, and they see an opportunity to switch sides and gain power. But the show gives Ulf a much more emotional motivation. He's humiliated, he's treated like he's disposable, and although he's promised incredible rewards, he's also mocked and manipulated. Eventually, all of that resentment explodes. Silverwing takes off, and suddenly Tumbleton becomes a nightmare. The destruction is chaotic, and the show places much more emphasis on Ulf himself as the source of the devastation. The book, meanwhile, presents something much broader and even darker. Both Ulf and Hugh turn their dragons against the Black Army, and the aftermath becomes one of the most horrific episodes of the dance. The town is sacked, and there's widespread violence, rape, and slaughter. So while the show makes the destruction feel like one man's rage exploding out of control, the book presents it as the horrifying consequence of a larger betrayal and the complete collapse of military discipline. So, what does all this mean? When you put all 11 changes together, it's pretty clear that House of the Dragon isn't trying to recreate Fire and Blood scene for scene. It's adapting the history. And because Fire and Blood itself is written almost like a historical record, with conflicting accounts, rumors, and uncertain details, the show has a lot of room to fill in the blanks. But Season 3 goes even further. It changes motivations, changes timelines, changes who survives, changes who betrays whom, and in some cases, it completely reverses the military situation. The biggest example might actually be Rhaenyra herself. The show is increasingly interested in her transformation from someone fighting for what she believes is her rightful throne into someone who believes destiny itself has selected her. And that could become extremely important as the dance moves toward its darkest chapters. Because here's the scary question. If Rhaenyra truly believes she's been chosen by prophecy to save Westeros, what happens when people stand in the way of that destiny? That's what makes these differences so fascinating. We already know where the broad history is supposed to go, but the show keeps changing the road that gets us there. And if it continues doing that, even people who've read Fire and Blood won't necessarily know exactly what happens next. So, which change did you find the most surprising? Helena's rewritten death, Ulf becoming the sole betrayer, Daemon showing up at Tumbleton, or maybe Rhaenyra finally revealing the Song of Ice and Fire to the people of King's Landing? Let me know in the comments. And if you enjoyed this breakdown, hit that like button. Subscribe for more House of the Dragon and Game of Thrones explanations, and I'll see you in the next one.
No, what the heck, I'll laugh anyway.